The morning Doris Freely died, somebody from the HOA taped a violation notice to her front door. I know this because I was the one who found it, flapping there in the October wind like a yellow tongue, while her body was still warm in the hospital bed across town. I pulled it off the door myself, read it standing on her porch with my coffee going cold in my other hand. The notice cited 3 violations. Unapproved exterior paint color on the mailbox post. Failure to maintain lawn edging along the south property line. And, this is the one that still sits in my chest like a coal, storage of unsightly personal items visible from the street. They meant her garden gnomes. Doris had 4 of them. She'd had them for 11 years, since before the HOA even existed in its current form, and every single board member who'd ever served on the architectural committee had walked past those gnomes without a word. But that was before Gerald Rankin became president. My name is May Coulter. I've lived at 14 Sycamore Lane in the Briarwood Crossing subdivision for 22 years. I raised my daughter here. I buried my husband from here. I know every crack in every sidewalk, every dog that barks at what hour, every family that moved in hopeful, and everyone that moved out tired. I am not a troublemaker. I have never in my life sought out a fight. But I need you to understand something about what happened in this neighborhood over the past 14 months, because the version Gerald tells, the version that ended up in the meeting minutes and the certified letters and the lien filings, is not what happened. Not even close. Doris was 81. She had lived at 22 Sycamore since the development was built. Her husband Frank poured the concrete for half the driveways on our street, including mine, and if you looked closely at the one in front of her house, you could see where he'd pressed their initials into the corner before it set. She kept her yard neat. She baked things for new neighbors. She was the kind of woman who remembered your dog's name and your kid's birthday, and never once made you feel like she was keeping score. She had also, I found out later, been receiving violation notices for 5 months before she died. 5 months. One after another, each one escalating in language, each one citing fines that compounded weekly. She never told me. She never told anyone on the street, as far as I could find out. She just kept putting them in a shoebox in her hall closet, and the fines kept adding up, and the letters kept getting meaner, and somewhere in there her heart decided it had carried enough. I am not saying Gerald Rankin killed Doris Freely. I am saying that when a woman who survived her husband by 9 years and never missed a property tax payment and kept fresh flowers on her porch, every single spring gets buried with $1,600 in outstanding HOA fines and a lien threat, dated the week she went into the hospital. Something has gone wrong. Something specific. Something with a name and a title and a seat at a folding table in the community clubhouse on the 2nd Tuesday of every month. I took the shoebox home with me after the funeral. Her nephew from Dayton said I could have whatever I wanted from the house. He was just going to sell it anyway. I didn't want her dishes or her furniture. I wanted that box. I sat at my kitchen table that night and I spread every single notice out in order, 23 of them. I read each one. I noted the dates, the signatures, the cited bylaws. And when I was done, I stacked them neatly and I put them back in the box and I set the box on the chair where my husband used to sit. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and I started reading the Briarwood Crossing CC&Rs from the beginning. The first time I saw Marjorie Klein was at the September board meeting, 3 weeks after Don passed. She'd been on the board less than a month herself, appointed to fill Cal Weber's seat after he moved to Tucson, and already she walked through the community center like she'd built it with her own hands. I'd come to the meeting because Don would have wanted me to. 31 years we'd lived in Ridgewood Commons, and Don never missed a board meeting, not once. He'd sit in the 3rd row, left side, with his little spiral notebook, and he'd write down every motion, every vote, every dollar figure they mentioned. After he retired from the county assessor's office, that notebook became his whole civic life, so I sat in his seat. I didn't bring a notebook. Marjorie was already at the front table when I walked in, seated between Phil Durning, who'd been board president since 2019, and a woman I didn't recognize. Marjorie had reading glasses on a beaded chain and a stack of papers arranged in front of her like place settings. She looked up when the door opened, and her eyes moved across me the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you were deciding whether to keep. The meeting started normal enough. Phil read the minutes. Somebody seconded them. There was talk about the drainage issue on Birchwood Lane. There had been talk about the drainage issue on Birchwood Lane for going on 2 years. Then Marjorie raised her hand and Phil gave her the floor like he'd been waiting for it. She had a proposal. That was the word she used. Not a suggestion, not an idea. A proposal. She wanted to restructure the common area maintenance schedule, consolidate the 2 part-time landscaping contracts into 1 full-service agreement, and, here's where my ears picked up, implement a special assessment of $400 per household to cover what she called deferred infrastructure needs. $400. Just like that, like she was ordering lunch. Now, I've lived through special assessments before. They happen. Roofs need replacing, pools need resurfacing, things wear out, but there's a way you bring that to people. You show them the numbers, you show them the bids, you walk them through it like adults, because that's what they are, and it's their money. Marjorie didn't show us anything. She said the documentation would be available upon request after the board voted. After. I looked around the room. There were maybe 20 people there, which was low even for September. A few of them were frowning. Most were just watching. Ed Parkhill, who'd lived here almost as long as Don and I had, caught my eye from across the aisle and gave me a look that said what I was thinking. But nobody said anything. That's the thing about these meetings. People come, they sit, they listen, they go home. The ones who speak up are the ones who always speak up, and half the time they're talking about their neighbors' trash cans. The ones with real questions sit quiet because they don't want to be that person. Don would have been that person. Don would have raised his hand and asked, in that calm, level voice of his, to see the line items before any vote was taken. He would have said it politely. He would have said it once. And it would have mattered, because everyone in that room knew Don had spent 30 years reading budgets for a living. I am not Don. I sat there and I watched Phil call the vote, and I watched 3 hands go up. Phil, Marjorie, and the woman I didn't recognize, who turned out to be Marjorie's neighbor, Sandra Foley, also newly appointed. And I watched $400 leave every household in Ridgewood Commons on a 3-2 vote with no documentation and no discussion. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a long time. The porch light was on because I'd started leaving it on. The house was quiet because it was always quiet now. I went inside, and I found Don's notebooks. The thing about cracks is you don't notice them until something shifts. Could be weather, could be time, could be somebody leaning on the wrong spot. But the crack was always there, you just weren't looking down. Margaret found the first one on a Tuesday. Not a crack in concrete, a crack in the books. She'd been treasurer of the Briarwood Commons Homeowners Association for 11 years, back when the position meant balancing a checkbook and making sure the landscaping contract got renewed every March. Simple work, honest work. The kind of thing you did because nobody else wanted to, and because you believed the neighborhood deserved someone who cared enough to count twice. She'd stepped down 2 years ago when her hip started giving her trouble and the board meetings moved to the second floor of the community center after the flooding ruined the ground-level room. Stairs and Margaret were no longer on speaking terms, so she handed the ledger to Don Kessler, who'd volunteered with the enthusiasm of a man who had just retired from selling commercial insurance and needed somewhere to put all that energy. Don was fine. Don was friendly. Don brought donuts to meetings and remembered everyone's dog's name. Don was also, as Margaret discovered that Tuesday morning while helping prepare documents for the annual audit, missing about $43,000. Not all at once. That's not how it works in a place like Briarwood Commons. Nobody writes themselves a check for $43,000 from a neighborhood association account. What they do is smaller. A landscaping invoice paid twice, once to the company, once to a secondary account with a name close enough to pass a glance. A pool maintenance contract inflated by 12%, the difference routed to a P.O. box registered to Don's brother-in-law in Cary. Emergency repair assessments for work that was either never completed or completed at a quarter of the billed cost. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her reading glasses and a yellow legal pad, and she went through every line item from the past 22 months. She drank 4 cups of coffee. She called no one. She checked her math 3 times because that's who Margaret was. The kind of person who checks 3 times before she says a word. By the time her daughter called that evening to ask about Sunday dinner, Margaret had filled 9 pages of the legal pad, front and back, and she had a feeling in her stomach like she'd swallowed a stone. Here's what made it worse. The annual meeting was in 6 weeks. The board had already drafted a proposal to increase quarterly dues by 15%, citing rising maintenance costs and necessary reserve fund contributions. Don had presented the numbers himself at the last board session. Smiled while he did it. Passed around a spreadsheet with color-coded columns. Everyone nodded because the spreadsheet had color-coded columns, and Don remembered their dogs' names. Margaret knew what would happen if she brought this to the board directly. She'd watched it happen to Cynthia Park 3 years ago when Cynthia raised concerns about the fence contractor's bid. The board had thanked Cynthia for her diligence and then voted unanimously to proceed. Cynthia got a violation notice for her mailbox post 2 weeks later. Coincidence? Probably. Probably. So Margaret did not call the board president. She did not call Don. She did not post on the neighborhood Facebook group or write a letter to the community newsletter. What Margaret did was make a copy of every document she had. Then she made a second copy. She put one in her filing cabinet, one in a fireproof safe in her closet, and she drove the originals to her nephew's house across town because her nephew was a forensic accountant for the state comptroller's office, and he owed her for 37 years of birthday cards with $20 bills inside. She told him to take his time. She told him to be thorough. She told him she could wait because she'd been waiting her whole life for people to do the right thing, and she'd learned that waiting was its own kind of weapon. The covenant amendments arrived in Marge Pellerin's mailbox on a Tuesday, which she later thought was fitting because nothing good in her life had ever happened on a Tuesday. 3 pages, single-spaced, with the kind of margins that suggested someone had a lot to say and not much paper to say it on. She read them standing at the end of her driveway, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, the Louisiana heat pressing against her like a hand. Section 4.11 was the one that stopped her breathing for a moment. All exterior modifications require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee, with a non-refundable review fee of $350 per submission. She thought about Gerald. She thought about what Gerald would have said, which was probably something like, "They can review this," followed by a gesture she wouldn't repeat in church. But Gerald had been gone 4 years now, and the house was hers, and the house needed a ramp. That was the thing people like Terence Browd never seemed to understand. The ramp wasn't decorative. The ramp wasn't a statement. The ramp was how Marge Pellerin planned to continue living in the house she and Gerald bought in 1987, back when Laurel Trace was just a name on a developer's sign, and the covenants fit on a single page and mostly said things like, "Keep your grass cut and don't park on the lawn." She'd already gotten the estimate from Robichaud's son, the one who did carpentry now. $1,200 for a simple wooden ramp, ADA grade, nothing fancy. Her right knee had been replaced in March, the left one was scheduled for October. The 3 porch steps she'd climbed 10,000 times had become a daily negotiation between her body and gravity was winning. She called the management office the next morning, spoke to a woman named Kendra who sounded young and tired, and like she was reading from a script when she explained that the Architectural Review Committee met on the first Thursday of each month, and that Mrs. Pellerin would need to submit her application along with the fee, and a detailed rendering of the proposed modification. A detailed rendering of a ramp. Marge asked if there was an exception process for medical necessity. Kendra put her on hold for 4 minutes and came back and said she'd need to speak with Mr. Broward about that. Marge asked when Mr. Broward might be available. Kendra said he was generally available at the monthly board meetings, which were open to residents during the first 15 minutes for public comment. 15 minutes. For the whole neighborhood, divided among however many people showed up with problems, which based on what Marge had been hearing from Doreen and Phil and the Nguyen's, was quite a few. She hung up and sat at her kitchen table and looked at the 3 pages again. She turned to the back, where the amendments were dated and signed. Terence Broward, board president. Beneath his signature, a line that read, "These amendments are enacted pursuant to the authority granted under the original Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions recorded with Terrebonne Parish, 1986. Marge had a copy of that original declaration. She knew she did. Gerald had kept every piece of paper related to this house in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, organized by year, because Gerald believed that a man's home was his castle, and a castle required documentation. She found it in the second drawer, in a manila folder labeled Laurel Trace. Original. She sat on the bed and read it, all of it, for the first time in decades, and there, on page 4, in language so plain it almost seemed quaint, was Section 7. No amendment to these covenants shall be valid unless approved by a 2/3 vote of all property owners in the development. She read it again, then a third time. Then she picked up the phone and called Doreen. The thing about Marge Pellerin is, she never raised her voice. Not once in the 14 months I'd known her. Not when the first fine arrived. Not when they towed her dead husband's truck out of her own driveway. Not even when Dunham stood on her porch and told her the memorial garden she'd planted for Ray violated Section 9.3 of the Architectural Guidelines. Unauthorized ornamental installation, he called it. 12 rose bushes and a bird bath. She just nodded and said she understood and closed her door, and I thought that was the end of Marge Pellerin. I was wrong about that the way I'd been wrong about most things that year. It was Carl Odom who told me. Carl lived 2 doors down from Marge and kept to himself mostly, fixed lawnmowers in his garage, never came to meetings. He caught me at the mailbox on a Tuesday and said, "You should talk to Marge." Just like that, no context. I asked him why, and he said because she's been talking to Baton Rouge. I didn't know what that meant. Carl didn't explain. He just collected his water bill and his coupon mailer and walked back up his driveway like he'd told me the weather. So I went to Marge's house that evening. She answered the door in reading glasses with a yellow legal pad in her hand and about 40 pages of printed documents on her kitchen table. And she said, "Come in. I made coffee," like she'd been expecting me for weeks. She had. What Marge had been doing, quietly, since the day they pulled up Ray's rose bushes with a rented bobcat, was requesting records. Every record the Cypress Bend Homeowners Association was legally required to maintain and make available to members upon written request, meeting minutes, financial disclosures, vendor contracts, insurance documentation, election procedures, assessment histories. She'd sent 11 certified letters over 9 months. She had the green return receipt cards in a neat stack held together with a binder clip. They'd responded to 3 of them, partially. Now here is where I need to tell you something about Marge that nobody on Ridgeline Drive knew because nobody had ever thought to ask. Before she married Ray and moved to Cypress Bend in 2006, Marge Pellerin spent 22 years as a compliance auditor for the Louisiana Department of Insurance. She knew what a financial disclosure was supposed to look like the way a carpenter knows what a plumb wall looks like. She could feel when something was off, and something was very off. The numbers Dunham's board had provided didn't reconcile. Not even close. The reserve fund they claimed held $112,000 corresponded to bank statements showing $41,000. The landscaping contract they'd awarded to a company called Green Line Solutions, LLC, was paid at nearly double the rate of every comparable bid Marge had pulled from public records for subdivisions our size. And Green Line Solutions, LLC, when Marge looked it up with the Secretary of State's office, listed as its registered agent 1 Timothy Dunham. She showed me all of this with the calm of someone sorting recipes, page by page, highlighted in 3 colors, cross-referenced with dates and resolution numbers. She had a timeline on the legal pad that went back to 2019 and every entry had a source document. I sat at her kitchen table and I felt something I hadn't felt since before all of this started. Not anger. I'd had plenty of anger. What I felt was the particular specific warmth of realizing you are not alone, and that the person beside you is not afraid and that they have been working while you were only suffering. Marge poured me a second cup of coffee and said, "I've already contacted the state." She said it without triumph. She said it the way you'd say the roast is almost done. A fact. A thing already in motion. I asked her what she needed from me. She said, "I need 12 more homeowners willing to sign a petition for a special meeting. That's what the bylaws require. Can you get me 12? I said, "Marge, I can get you 20. She nodded and wrote something on her legal pad, and that was the night the fog started to lift. The thing about pulling a thread is you have to be willing to let the whole garment come apart. Most people aren't. Most people see that first loose strand, and they tuck it back in, smooth it down, pretend the weave is still holding. Marge Kellerman was not most people. She'd spent 3 weeks after the record's request sitting at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator that still printed on receipt paper. The little curls of white tape piled up like wood shavings around a carpenter's bench. Every number she ran told the same story. Every column she cross-referenced pointed the same direction. The HOA's reserve fund was short. Not a little short. Not rounding error short. $114,000 short. Now Marge had been an auditor for the State Comptroller's Office for 22 years before she retired. She'd seen every flavor of financial misdirection a mid-level bureaucrat could dream up. She'd seen invoices for equipment that didn't exist, maintenance contracts with companies that shared addresses with board members' cousins, and once, memorably, a parks department that paid a landscaping crew for 18 months after the crew's owner had died. So when she looked at the Ridgewood Crossing HOA's financials and saw payments to Lakeshore Property Solutions, a company with no website, no reviews, no physical address beyond a P.O. box indicator, she didn't gasp. She didn't call anyone. She circled the entries in red pen and kept going. 14 payments over 2 years, each one between $6,000 and $9,000. Each one approved by the board under the line item, exterior maintenance and grounds consultation. Marge had walked every inch of Ridgewood Crossing. She knew which sidewalk panels were cracked and which gutters still held leaves from last October. Whatever Lakeshore Property Solutions was consulting on, it wasn't visible to the naked eye. She brought it to Don first because Don had the steadiest hands of anyone she knew. Not emotionally. The man could get worked up about a grocery store running out of his brand of coffee, but procedurally. Don understood that the distance between discovering a problem and solving it was paved with documentation, not outrage. They sat on his back porch, the one Braddock had cited for the planter violation, and Don read through her notes without interrupting. When he finished, he set the pages down and looked out at the yard for a long time. "You're sure about the company?" he said. "I'm sure it doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. And the amounts stay under $10,000 each." "Every single one." Don nodded slowly. That threshold mattered, and they both knew why. Structured payments designed to avoid triggering additional oversight. It was a pattern so common, it had a name in Marge's old profession. Smurfing, they called it, though the word sounded too whimsical for what it described. "We need the incorporation records," Don said. Already requested them from the Secretary of State. Should have them by Friday. He looked at her then with something that wasn't quite surprise, but was close to it. Respect, maybe, for the machinery she'd already set in motion before she ever knocked on his door. Braddock know you pulled the financials. He knows I made the request. He doesn't know what I found. Good. Let's keep it that way. Marge gathered her papers and slid them back into the manila folder she'd labeled simply Thread in her careful block handwriting. She paused at the porch steps. Don, when those incorporation records come back, if they show what I think they'll show, then we take it to the full membership. Not the board. The board approved those payments, Marge. Every last one. She nodded once, tucked the folder under her arm, and walked home through the warm evening air. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler kicked on. A dog barked twice and stopped. Ridgewood Crossing looked exactly the way it always had, which was the trick of it. The surface held even when everything underneath had already started to give. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, which told you everything you needed to know about how seriously the board took it. 7 on a Tuesday. Like it was routine. Like Margaret Huang hadn't spent 4 months assembling a binder thick enough to stop a door. She arrived at 6:30 because that's who she was. Set her things at the end of the second row. Binder. Water bottle. Reading glasses in the case her daughter had given her for Christmas. She didn't look nervous. She looked like a woman who had read every bylaw twice and the CC&Rs 3 times and had found the thing they hoped nobody would ever find. The community room filled slowly. Doris came in first, then the Patels, then Frank Wasilewski, who hadn't attended a meeting in 2 years but who Margaret had called personally on Sunday afternoon. She called 11 people. 9 showed up. That was more than enough. Voss arrived at 6:58 with Cheryl Toombs and the new guy, Alderman, who'd been appointed to fill the seat after Jerry Coe moved to Tucson. They sat at the folding table at the front like they always did. Voss had his laptop open before he sat down. Cheryl had a legal pad. Alderman had nothing, which was honest at least. The agenda was 4 items. Margaret's request had been listed last, under new business, described only as homeowner concern regarding reserve fund allocation, which was like describing a house fire as a temperature event. They got through the first 3 items in 40 minutes. Landscaping contract renewal. Pool hours for the summer. A broken gate sensor on the east entrance that had been broken since March. Voss moved through each one with the flat efficiency of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Then they reached item 4. Margaret stood up. She didn't go to the podium, because there wasn't one. She just stood at her seat and opened the binder. I'd like to address the board regarding the special assessment levied in October and the reserve fund expenditures for the last 18 months. Voss nodded like he was granting permission. You have 5 minutes, Margaret. I'll take what I need, she said. Not rude, not loud, just clear. She started with the numbers. The special assessment had been $4,200 per household, approved by the board in a closed session that the bylaws did not authorize. She read the relevant section aloud. Article 9, Section 4. Assessments exceeding $2,000 required a vote of the general membership. There had been no vote. Voss started to interrupt. Margaret held up one finger, just one, and kept reading. The reserve fund had contained $312,000 at the start of the fiscal year. It now contained $81,000. The difference had been paid to a contractor called Ridgeline Property Solutions, which was registered to a business address in Henderson that was also the home address of Voss's brother-in-law, Dale Toombs, Cheryl's brother. Margaret let that sit for a moment. She didn't editorialize. She just read the registration document and set it on the table. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when people realize they are witnessing something that cannot be taken back. She went through the invoices next. 3 of them had been paid for work that was never performed. She had photographs dated and time-stamped. She had the county permit office's confirmation that no permits had been pulled for the projects described. She had an email from Dale Toombs's own website listing his services, which did not include 2 of the 3 categories invoiced. When she finished, she closed the binder and sat down. Frank Wasilewski spoke first. "I move that we call for an independent audit of the reserve fund and all board expenditures for the past 24 months, Doris seconded. Voss said the motion was out of order. Margaret opened the binder again to a tabbed section near the back and read aloud the provision that allowed any motion from the floor during open session if seconded by a dues current member. The vote carried 9-0. The board's 3 votes were not required and not requested. Cheryl Toombs left without her legal pad. "I need to write Chapter 8 without having written the previous chapters. Since I don't have the prior chapter's content, I'll write this final chapter as the resolution/catharsis. Chapter of an HOA revenge justice narrative, maintaining the genre's tone and emotional arc. Let me craft this carefully." The morning after the vote, the fog hadn't lifted yet, but nobody seemed to mind. I sat on my porch with coffee that had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago, watching the street do what it always does at 7:15. Sprinklers clicking on, Gary's truck idling too long in his driveway, the Okafor kids waiting for the bus with their backpacks dragging on the sidewalk like they weighed 40 pounds each. Normal things. The kind of things that had been normal before Darlene Maddox decided they weren't good enough for her version of Briarwood Glen. She was gone now, not from the neighborhood. You can't vote someone out of their house, much as some folks might have wanted to, but from the board. From the position she'd welded herself into for 6 years like it was a birthright. President Maddox, with her certified letters and her selective enforcement, and her way of making you feel like your own front yard was a courtroom. Gone. 7-2. The margin wasn't even close. I keep thinking about what Ruth said to me the night before the meeting, standing in her garage with 3 ring binders stacked on the hood of her Camry like sandbags. She'd looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. She said, "I just want to be able to plant my tomatoes without someone telling me the cages are a visual obstruction." And she laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that has a crack running through it. Ruth had done the work, not the dramatic kind. Nobody kicked down a door or gave a speech that made people cry. She'd read the bylaws, all of them. She cross-referenced every fine Darlene issued in the last 4 years against the actual covenant language, and found that 61% of them had no enforceable basis. 61%. She'd put it in a spreadsheet. She'd printed copies for every household and walked them door to door on a Saturday when her knees were acting up and it was 92 degrees. That's what gets me. People talk about justice like it's a lightning bolt, like someone stands up and the truth rings out and the villain crumbles. But what actually happened was a retired school librarian with bad knees spent 3 months reading documents nobody else wanted to read, and she did it because Darlene fined her $85 for a tomato cage. The new board held its first meeting last Thursday. I won't pretend it was exciting. They talked about the pool schedule and whether to repave the cul-de-sac on Winding Oak. Normal things. Helen Park is president now, and she ran the meeting in 40 minutes flat, which might be a record for any governing body in human history. Nobody mentioned Darlene. There was no gloating. That part matters to me, so I want to say it clearly. Nobody gloated. When it was over, people stood around in the community room eating store-bought cookies and talking about their kids and the weather, and it felt like something had been set back down that had been held too tight for too long. I drove past Darlene's house this morning. Her lawn was perfect, same as always. Her shutters were straight, her mailbox didn't have a single smudge on it. I don't feel sorry for her, but I don't feel triumphant either. I feel like a bone that was out of place finally got pushed back in. It still aches a little. But it works again. Ruth's tomatoes are coming in. She brought me 3 last week, still warm from the vine, and she didn't say a word about any of it. Just handed them over in a plastic grocery bag and told me the brandy wines were better this year than the Cherokees. I set them on my kitchen counter and looked at them for a long time. Some things are just ordinary enough to be worth fighting for.